The summons arrived at the worst possible hour, encoded in the old diplomatic cipher that Valeth Koss had not used in 11 years. She read it standing in the dim kitchen of her rented quarters on Tessara Station, a waypoint so far from the Concord's inner worlds that most star charts did not bother naming it. The message was 3 lines. The Presidium of the Interstellar Concord had convened a closed tribunal to adjudicate 12 standing verdicts against the Terran Confederation. She was recalled from exile to serve as humanity's advocate. She had until the chamber's dawn bell to accept or forfeit. Valeth set the message down and looked at the wall. 11 years. 11 years since the Concord had stripped her credentials, revoked her transit privileges, and declared her persona non grata across 6 sovereign corridors. Her crime had been a single sentence spoken into a live session record. The Presidium's evidence against the Terran delegation is fabricated. For that, the Presidium's arbiter had invoked Article 14, the Exile Clause, and Valeth had walked out of the Tessarine Grand Chamber with nothing but the clothes on her narrow shoulders and the knowledge that she had been right. Now they needed her back. She could taste the desperation in the cipher's age. The old codes meant this had bypassed official channels. Someone on the Presidium wanted this quiet. Someone else, perhaps, wanted it loud. There was a particular cruelty in the timing. The Concord had held these verdicts for over a decade. 12 charges, accumulated 1 per year like rings in a dying tree, each one tightening the noose around the Terran Confederation's position in galactic politics, trade embargoes, mining forfeitures, territorial sanctions, diplomatic restrictions, the slow, methodical strangulation of a species standing through procedural violence. And now, with the final verdict about to cement total expulsion under Article 14, someone had arranged for humanity to receive one last chance to argue. 1 advocate, 1 night, 12 verdicts. Valeth did not believe in coincidence at this level of institutional choreography. She transmitted her acceptance before the hour was out. Her hands were steady. Her pulse was not. 11 years of exile had not dulled the memory of the chamber, its acoustics, its sight lines, the way Doranth's voice carried from the bench like something poured from a height. She had rehearsed this moment in her mind so many times that it had worn a groove in her thinking, a channel through which every scenario ran. The evidence presented, the objections raised, the votes tallied, the dawn bell ringing over a chamber that had either listened or had not. She had always known the summons would come. The humans had told her it would, in their way, which was to say nothing and to prepare for everything. The transit shuttle from Tessara Station to the Grand Spire took 40 minutes. Valeth spent them reviewing the contents of a data satchel that had been delivered to her quarters 6 weeks earlier, wrapped in unmarked cargo packing, with no return address and no sender identification. Inside were 23 data chips, each labeled in a hand she did not recognize. The labels were dates. The dates matched the 12 verdicts. She had spent 6 weeks verifying every chip against public records, cross-referencing, running authentication protocols on her personal terminal until the terminal overheated, and she had to prop the window open to the station's recycled air. Every chip had checked out. Whoever had sent them had been thorough, patient, and angry in exactly the right way. The tribunal chamber occupied the upper dome of the Tessarine Grand Spire, a vaulted amphitheater of pale stone and brushed alloy that seated 1,100. Valeth had not stood in this room since the day they cast her out. The air still smelled the same, recycled atmosphere cut with the faint chlorine tang of Kalori skin secretions and the dry mineral scent of Orovon exoskeletons. She paused at the threshold, feeling the stone under her shoes shift from the utilitarian composite of the spire's service corridors to the polished granite of the chamber floor. The temperature dropped. The chamber was always cold, kept at a median comfortable for 11 species, which meant comfortable for none. She let the light from the glass dome above wash over her. Through the dome, the daytime sky of Tessara Prime glowed a deep cerulean, and high in that sky, barely visible, The running lights of 3 Terran frigates held station in a lazy orbit. They had been there for 6 days. The Presidium had not acknowledged them. The Concord's official position was that the frigates were conducting routine navigational exercises. Valith knew better. The humans never positioned warships without intent, and their intent was never casual. She descended the center aisle. Her legs were thinner than they had been. Exile did not fatten anyone. Her formal coat, charcoal with silver piping at the collar, hung loose at her wrists. She was Rithani, not human. Her skin was the color of wet slate, her eyes large and dark with a secondary membrane that flickered when she was thinking hard. She had served as humanity's appointed liaison to the Concord for 9 years before the exile, and in that time she had learned something the Presidium had never bothered to understand. Humans did not bluff. They did not threaten. They did not posture. They prepared, and when the preparation was complete, they acted with a precision that made the action look inevitable. The arbiter's bench rose at the chamber's north end, a curved slab of polished obsidian behind which 12 seated figures waited. 12 adjudicators, drawn from 12-member species. At the center sat presiding Arbiter Doranth Vale, a Kalori elder whose blue-gray skin had gone nearly white with age. His 4-fingered hands rested flat on the bench, and his expression was the careful neutral of a predator watching from a high ledge. To his left, the Kalori adjudicator Cenith Ral sat with her jaw set and her pale eyes fixed on Valith. To his right, the Seathrani adjudicator Marinith Saloon folded her long silver fingers and watched without expression. The gallery tiers were full. 1,100 seats, everyone occupied. Diplomats, military attaches, trade commissioners, intelligence officers, scribes, and in the upper tiers, the recording apparatus that would broadcast every word to every diplomatic post in the Concord's jurisdiction. Valith felt their attention settle on her like a physical weight as she took her place at the advocate's podium, a slender column of brushed steel at the chamber's center. The tribunal recognizes Valith Kas, recalled from exile under emergency provision, Doranth said. His voice carried the slow, wet articulation of Kalori's speech. You are appointed advocate for the Terran Confederation in the matter of 12 standing verdicts issued by this body over the preceding 11 years. The Terran Confederation has declined to send a representative of its own species. You are their sole voice. Valith inclined her head. She did not speak. The gallery murmured. The format is as follows, Doranth continued. Each verdict will be read into the record. You may challenge each verdict with evidence or argument. The 12 adjudicators will then vote to sustain or vacate. A simple majority vacates. You have until the dawn bell. He paused. Do you understand the format? I do, Valith said, 2 words. She had learned economy from the humans. Doranth's secondary eyelids flickered. He had expected more. They always did. The Concord's procedural culture was built on rhetoric, on the assumption that volume and duration correlated with conviction. Humans had taught Valith otherwise. Read the first verdict, Doranth said. The clerk of record, an Oravan whose segmented carapace gleamed under the dome light, unrolled a display scroll. Verdict 1. Issued 11 years prior. The Terran Confederation is found guilty of falsifying its military census to the Concord, understating its active fleet tonnage by a factor of 9. Penalty: trade embargo on Terran military components, ongoing. The gallery was silent. Valith reached into the satchel at her hip and withdrew a data chip. She placed it on the podium scanner without comment. The chamber's holographic array activated, projecting a column of figures above her head in pale cyan light. The Terran Confederation did not falsify its census, Valith said. It reported its active fleet tonnage accurately at the time of filing. The Concord's own intelligence bureau estimated a higher figure and presented that estimate as evidence of fraud. The discrepancy existed because the Concord's analysts used a tonnage classification that includes civilian cargo haulers. The Terran filing used a classification that does not. She tapped the podium. The holographic column split into two parallel lists, the Concord's inflated tally on the left, the Terran filing on the right. The Concord's own classification standards manual, section 14, subsection 3, permits either methodology. The Terran delegation cited its methodology in a footnote on the original filing. That footnote was removed from the tribunal's evidentiary record before the vote. Silence. One of the adjudicators, a Vashini delegate with iridescent scales and a crest that had gone flat against her skull, leaned forward and whispered to her neighbor. Dorrant's expression did not change. Who removed the footnote? The office of the clerk of record, on instruction from the Presidium's intelligence liaison. Valeth placed a second chip on the scanner. A communication log appeared in the holographic display. Dates, sender codes, and a single directive. Redact Terran methodology note prior to tribunal session. The sender code resolved to a name the gallery recognized. 1,200 heads turned toward the intelligence gallery, where a Kalori officer in formal gray sat very still, his hands gripping the armrests hard enough that the metal creaked. The adjudicators voted, 9-3, verdict 1 vacated. Valeth watched the vote register on the holographic tally above the bench. 9 cyan marks on one side, 3 amber on the other. The cyan marks pulsed once and held. She had seen hundreds of votes in this chamber during her years of service, had watched the tally lights register decisions that shaped trade routes and defense treaties and the fates of entire populations. She had never been the one standing at the podium when the lights changed. The weight of it was different from this angle. From the gallery, a vote was an abstraction. From the podium, it was a door opening. The gallery exhaled. Valeth did not. She was already reaching for the next chip. The 3 dissenting votes had come from the Kalori adjudicator Cenith Rawl, the Peloran adjudicator, and a third she identified after a moment as the representative from the Chelori Compact, a minor polity with heavy Kalori trade dependencies. She filed the alignment. 3 dissents, all within Kalori economic orbit. In the intelligence gallery, the Kalori officer leaned forward to whisper to an aide. The aide left at a pace that was not quite a run. Valeth watched him go. Whatever they communicated, whatever countermeasures they attempted, the record was the record, and the record was being broadcast live. Read the second verdict, Doranth said. Verdict 2, issued 10 years prior. The Terran Confederation is found guilty of unauthorized military construction in the Kavari Neutral Zone. Penalty: forfeiture of Terran mining rights in the Kavari Belt, ongoing. Valeth placed the chip. The holographic display shifted to a star chart, the Kavari Belt rendered in amber wireframe with a single structure blinking at its center. The construction in question was a field hospital. Its structural specifications are on record with the Concord's own Humanitarian Affairs Bureau, which approved the construction permit 14 months before the verdict was issued. The permit was filed under the Terran Confederation's humanitarian designation, assigned after the Rithani plague crisis. She advanced the display to show the permit, stamped and countersigned by 3 Concord bureaus. The tribunal classified it as military construction because the hospital contained a standard Terran medical fabricator, which the Concord's weapons registry lists as dual use. The same fabricator model is present in 43 Concord member hospitals. None of those have been classified as military installations. 43 hospital locations blinked on the star chart in soft amber, scattered across Concord space like a constellation of hypocrisy. Adjudicator Soren Thai, a broad-shouldered Drenai whose people had benefited from those hospitals during the plague, closed his eyes and tilted his head forward in the Drenai gesture of grief acknowledged. The vote was 10-2. Verdict 2 vacated. Valeth noted the adjudicators who had voted to sustain, and the way the Tessarine elder beside Soren Thai had removed her spectacles to clean them, the nervous habit of someone recalibrating assumptions in real time. When judges looked at each other instead of the advocate, it meant they were no longer defending the verdicts. They were defending themselves. She placed the next chip on the scanner before the clerk had finished reading Verdict 3. Verdict 3, issued 9 years prior. The Terran Confederation is found guilty of espionage against Concord member state Kalar, specifically the interception and decryption of classified Kalori diplomatic communications. Espionage was a killing charge in the Concord. Historically, it carried fleet seizure and permanent exclusion. Valith felt the weight of the chamber shift, the hostility crystallize. 2 Kalori diplomats in the upper tiers leaned forward with the synchronized motion of predators scenting opportunity. The intercepted communications were broadcast on an unencrypted public frequency during the Rithani plague crisis, Valith said. The Terran monitoring station on Outpost Yellen 4 logged them as part of its standard humanitarian sweep, authorized by the Concord under Emergency Protocol 7. The communications contained Kalori diplomatic traffic because the Kalori Foreign Ministry had routed classified traffic through the public humanitarian band to save bandwidth on its military channels. She placed the chip. A routing order appeared, stamped with the Kalori Foreign Ministry's own seal. The Terran Confederation reported the accidental intercept to the Signals Arbitration Board within 72 hours. The board's acknowledgement is in the record. The tribunal was not shown the acknowledgement. Dorrant's hands pressed harder against the obsidian. Who withheld the acknowledgement? The same intelligence liaison who redacted the footnote in Verdict 1. The vote was 8-4, Verdict 3 vacated. Both Kalori-aligned seats held firm, joined by the Chelori and the Peloran, species with active intelligence-sharing agreements with Kalori Signals Command. The voting pattern was a map of the corruption's reach. Doranth shifted in his seat. The movement was small, but Valith had spent 9 years reading alien body language, and she recognized it, the first physical sign of a being who had expected a different outcome. He had thought the espionage charge would hold. He had thought the word itself would be heavy enough to overcome the evidence. He had been wrong. Verdict 4, the clerk read, issued 8 years prior. The Terran Confederation is found guilty of harboring a fugitive from Concord justice, specifically the Rithani National Valith Kas, convicted under Article 14 for disruption of tribunal proceedings. Every eye found Valith. She stood at the podium, still and composed, her secondary membranes half closed. She had known this one was coming. She had carried the weight of it for 8 years, the knowledge that her exile had been weaponized. The Terran Confederation did not harbor me, she said. I was exiled to Tessara Station, outside Concord jurisdiction. I did not enter Terran space, installations, or vessels at any point. The Concord's own border logs confirm this. She placed the chip. 8 years of transit records cascaded through the display. The charge was filed because the Terran embassy continued to include my name on its correspondence as advisor, inactive status. This is a bureaucratic designation carrying no salary, authority, or access. The Concord's own Diplomatic Standards Code, Article 61, permits member states to retain inactive advisors without triggering a harboring charge. The tribunal did not consult Article 61. Doranth interrupted. The tribunal's interpretation of Article 61 was within its discretionary authority. Valith let the silence stretch for 2 seconds. The tribunal did not interpret Article 61, presiding arbiter. The tribunal did not reference it. It does not appear in the verdict's reasoning. It was not discussed in the session record. She paused. The tribunal was not aware it existed, or it was aware and chose not to raise it. The vote was 7-5, the closest margin yet. The harboring charge was personal, and some adjudicators were uncomfortable with the spectacle of an exile dismantling her own conviction. Discomfort was not a legal standard, and the evidence was the evidence. Vacated. Verdict 5, the clerk read, issued 7 years prior. The Terran Confederation is found guilty of unauthorized territorial expansion in the Vethani Reach, claiming sovereignty over 3 uninhabited systems without Concord survey approval. Valith placed the chip. The 3 systems were surveyed by a joint Terran-Rethani expedition under Exploration Mandate 17, which requires a joint filing within 1 standard year. The Terran Confederation filed within 6 months. The filing was rejected because the Rethani co-signatory, myself, had been exiled and therefore lacked standing. She paused to let the circularity land. The Concord exiled me. The Concord then used my exile to invalidate a filing that my exile had nothing to do with. The exploration data, the survey results, and the joint mandate were all valid. The only invalid element was my political status, which the Concord itself had altered. The Peloran adjudicator, who had voted to sustain on every previous verdict, switched his vote for the first time. Valith watched his face as the tally was read. He looked like a man who had been carrying a heavy object and had just realized he could set it down. The circularity argument had reached him where the redaction evidence had not. Some minds needed to see the mechanism of injustice laid bare in its own contradictions before they would acknowledge it existed. 9-3. Verdict 5 vacated. 5 verdicts dismantled. The session had been running for nearly 4 hours. Valith's throat ached, and the cold of the chamber had settled into her joints with the slow persistence of water finding its level. She had not eaten since the shuttle. She had not slept in 30 hours. These were facts she filed and set aside, the way she had learned to file discomfort during the years on Tessara Station, where the heating failed every 3rd cycle, and the food dispensers served the same 4 meals in rotation, until the flavors blurred into a single gray nutrition. The gallery was no longer murmuring. It was listening with the focused intensity of a body that had begun to understand it was watching something historic. Valith's satchel was still half full of data chips. She had prepared for months. She had prepared, in truth, for 11 years. Verdict 6, the clerk read. His voice had lost its ceremonial steadiness. Issued 6 years prior. The Terran Confederation is found guilty of inciting civil unrest among conquered member populations through the distribution of unauthorized cultural materials. Valith kept her face neutral. The cultural materials were Terran agricultural manuals, translated into 7 conquered languages and distributed through the Concord's own Humanitarian Affairs Bureau under Program 12, the Famine Relief Initiative. Instructions for hydroponics, soil remediation, and seed banking, requested by the Rethani Agricultural Ministry, the Vashini Colonial Authority, and the Drenai Frontier Commission. She placed the chip. 3 formal requests appeared, each bearing the seal of the requesting government. The tribunal classified them as unauthorized cultural materials because they contained a foreword by a Terran agricultural scientist who, in a separate publication 2 years later, criticized the Concord's food distribution policies. The tribunal attributed his later criticism to the manuals retroactively. She let the pause do its work. The manuals contain crop rotation schedules. A sound escaped the gallery. It might have been laughter. It might have been disbelief. It might have been the sound 1,000 beings make when they realize collectively and at once that the institution they serve has been using their procedural trust as a weapon. In the upper tiers, a Drenai trade commissioner covered his face with one broad hand. His shoulders shook. Beside him, a Tessarine cultural attaché stared at the holographic display with an expression that suggested she was mentally rewriting every report she had filed in the past 6 years. 11-1. Verdict 6 vacated. The lone dissent came from Zenith Rawl. Even the Chelori and the Peloran had abandoned the sustaining position. Only Rawl held, isolated on the obsidian bench like a last defensive position on a collapsing front. In the gallery, 2 Chelori diplomatic aides had stopped taking notes, sitting with blank faces, the careful stillness of beings who understood that the official record was now the enemy. The intelligence liaison had not returned to his seat. His aide sat alone in the intelligence gallery, staring at a blank terminal. Verdict 7, the clerk read. His carapace segments had begun clicking, a sign of Orovon stress he could not suppress. Issued 5 years prior, the Terran Confederation is found guilty of weapons proliferation, specifically the transfer of kinetic shielding technology to the non-member state of Drekari. Valith placed the chip. The transfer was completed under a mutual defense pact that predates the Drekari's expulsion from the Concord by 3 years, completed 9 months before the expulsion vote. A timeline appeared in the display. The transfer on the left, the expulsion on the right, 14 months of empty space between them. Under Concord temporal adjudication standards, Article 9, a charge cannot be retroactively applied to an act that was legal at the time of commission. The tribunal did not cite the temporal standards. They were not consulted. The fabrication was so surgical it had a kind of professional elegance. Someone had built this verdict the way an engineer builds a bridge, with careful attention to load-bearing lies. 10-2, Verdict 7 vacated. Dorrant's composure cracked for the first time, a tightening of the muscles around his mouth that pulled his thin lips into a rigid line. The gallery saw it. The recording system saw it. 1,100 delegates watched the presiding arbiter's mask slip, and they filed it in the growing ledger of evidence that the man running this tribunal was not its impartial guardian but its architect. 7 down, 5 to go. The dawn bell was 3 hours distant. Through the dome, the sky had deepened, and the 3 Terran frigates were now sharp, dark silhouettes, hull markings legible to anyone with enhanced optics. A Tessarine scribe had trained a recording lens on them, capturing their unmoving formation as a visual footnote to the session record. Valith allowed herself a moment. She placed both hands flat on the podium and felt the vibration of the chamber's environmental systems through the steel, a low hum that had been there all night, constant and indifferent, the pulse of a building that did not care what happened inside it. She thought of the Kaylori archivist Kell would later tell her about, the woman who had copied the banking records and lost her career for it. She did not know the archivist's name yet, would not learn it for hours, but she felt the shape of that sacrifice in the evidence she carried, the way you can feel the weight of a hand that placed something carefully into a box before sealing it shut. Her throat was raw from hours of sustained projection in the domed acoustic space. She reached beneath the podium and found a water vessel that someone had placed there during Verdict 3. She drank, set the vessel down, and returned her attention to the bench. The chamber had changed. 6 hours ago, the gallery had been divided between curiosity and hostility. Now the hostility was gone, replaced by something more dangerous to the Presidium: attention. Verdict 8, the clerk read, issued 4 years prior. The Terran Confederation is found guilty of dereliction of diplomatic duty, specifically the failure to attend 7 consecutive Concord Assembly sessions. Valith let the silence stretch for 3 seconds. The Terran Confederation's delegation was barred from attending those sessions. The bar was imposed by the Presidium Security Directorate under a standing order that classified the Terran delegation as a security risk, citing verdicts 1 through 5 as justification. She let that settle. Verdicts already vacated tonight, used as the foundation for another verdict. The delegation filed formal protests for each session, 7 protests over 4 years. Each was received, logged, and filed with the notation acknowledged, no action required. She placed the chip. The 7 protest filings appeared, each bearing the Concord's receipt stamp. The Concord barred humanity from the chamber. The Concord then charged humanity with failing to appear in the chamber it was barred from. The gallery reacted with unmistakable anger, not at Valith, not at the Terran Confederation, at the record, at the institutional machinery that had ground forward for years, stamping and processing the paperwork of injustice with bureaucratic efficiency. A Drenai diplomat in the 3rd tier stood and walked out. He did not slam the door. He simply left, and the sound of his footsteps in the corridor was louder than any shout. 12-0, unanimous. Even Zenith Rahl voted to vacate. She had to. The evidence was so damning that a sustaining vote would have been an open confession of complicity, broadcast live. In the upper gallery, a second diplomat walked out. 3 more whispered urgently into personal communication devices. Faces turned from the recording apparatus. The chamber was beginning to hemorrhage, not in panic, but in the slow, controlled bleeding of an institution discovering its foundation was sand. Doranth did not call the next verdict immediately. He sat still, staring at Valeth with the expression of a being who had miscalculated badly and was only now counting the cost. He turned to the adjudicators. "The bench will take a 15-minute recess." "I object," Valeth said. The chamber went quiet. Every delegate went still. "On what grounds?" Doranth asked. "The tribunal format specifies continuous proceedings until the dawn bell. A recess requires a 2/3 vote of the adjudicators, per Section 31 of the Tribunal Procedural Code." She looked at Doranth, not the adjudicators. She held his gaze the way she had been taught in high-stakes negotiation, steadily, without aggression, without submission. "Does the presiding arbiter wish to call for a vote?" He knew the math. After 8 vacated verdicts, including 1 unanimous, the adjudicators would not grant him a recess. A vote would be another public humiliation. He had tried to buy time, to regroup, perhaps to communicate with the intelligence liaison who had vanished from the gallery 3 hours ago. She had closed that door in 4 sentences. Doranth withdrew the request with a tilt of his head. The tilt was controlled, the gesture of a diplomat who had spent a lifetime calibrating movements for the record. But the tendons in his wrist stood out like cables against the obsidian. "Read the 9th verdict," he said. His voice had lost its ceremonial smoothness. It was clipped, compressed, the voice of a man running out of room. Verdict 9. Issued 3 years prior. The Terran Confederation is found guilty of biological contamination of the Sethrani agricultural world of Uran-3 through the introduction of Terran microbiota via an improperly sterilized cargo vessel. Valeth placed the chip. The cargo vessel was a Rithani freighter under Concord charter, crewed by Rithani nationals, operating under Concord biosecurity protocols. The Terran Confederation had no ownership, operational control, or crew presence aboard. The biosecurity certification was issued by the Concord's own port authority on Tessara Station. The certification appeared, stamped and dated, alongside the crew manifest showing 0 Terran personnel. The microbiota were Terran in origin because the vessel's previous port of call was a Terran agricultural station, where it loaded grain purchased by the Concord's Humanitarian Affairs Bureau under Program 12. She paused. The Concord's own supply chain introduced the microbiota. The Concord's own protocols failed to catch it. The Concord charged the Terran Confederation. The Sethrani adjudicator, Marinith Saloon, stood from her seat. She did not speak. She held Doranth's gaze for 4 seconds and sat again. The gesture was clear in Sethrani protocol. "I withdraw my confidence in this proceeding's integrity." A formal act, recorded by the chamber's systems, that could not be undone. The clerk of record paused, his carapace clicking in a continuous rattle, the Oravan equivalent of a human's hands shaking uncontrollably. He had served this tribunal for 2 decades, had read every verdict into the original record, and was now watching those rulings dismantled one by one, each dismantling revealing that the evidence he had processed had been corrupted before it reached his desk. 11-1. Verdict 9 vacated. 9 verdicts dismantled. The tribunal's own record now contained more evidence of institutional corruption than any single proceeding in the Concord's 3-century history. Valeth thought of the humans, of the 3 frigates in orbit that had not moved, not transmitted, not deviated from their formation. Of Commander Kell, standing in the corridor outside, waiting with the patience that characterized every Terran diplomatic engagement she had ever witnessed. They did not need to be in this chamber. They had sent Valeth. They had sent the evidence. And they had trusted the process, not because the process was inherently trustworthy, but because they had ensured that the evidence was strong enough to overcome even a corrupted process. That was the thing about humans that most species never understood. They did not trust institutions. They trusted preparation. Verdict 10, the clerk read. Issued 2 years prior. The Terran Confederation is found guilty of interfering in the internal governance of Concord member state Vashini, specifically by funding opposition candidates in the Vashini colonial elections. Valeth placed the chip. The funding came from the Terran Cultural Exchange Program, which provides grants to educational institutions across the Concord. One grant recipient, the Vashini Institute for Interstellar Governance, hosted a public lecture series in which several speakers subsequently ran for colonial office. The grant funded the lecture series, not any candidacy. The speaker's decision to run occurred 7 months after the series concluded. She advanced the display. The Concord's own Election Integrity Commission investigated the grant at the Vashini government's request and found no evidence of electoral interference. Its report was filed 6 months before the tribunal issued Verdict 10. The tribunal did not reference the report. The Vashini adjudicator, her scales shifted from iridescent green to a muted gray she could not consciously control, spoke for the first time. Was the commission's report available to the tribunal at the time of the vote? It was filed in the tribunal's standard evidence repository, tagged, indexed, and available for review. It was not included in the evidence packet presented to the adjudicators. By whom was the evidence packet assembled? Valeth did not need to answer. The chamber already knew. She let the silence speak. 10-2, Verdict 10 vacated. 2 left. The chamber had been in session for over 6 hours. Valeth's legs ached from standing. Her throat was raw, but her mind was clear in a way it had not been since the day of her exile, clear with the focused intensity of someone who had spent 11 years sharpening a single argument and was now delivering it in the room where the argument was born. Several dozen delegates had left during the preceding hours. Those who remained sat with the attentive stillness of people watching something that would be studied for years. This was no longer a closed tribunal. It was a public reckoning. The dawn was beginning to light the sky beyond the glass dome. Verdict 11, the clerk read. Issued 18 months prior. The Terran Confederation is found guilty of constructing a covert surveillance network within Concord sovereign space, specifically a series of deep space monitoring arrays in the Tessarine corridor. Valeth placed the chip. Engineering schematics filled the display. The arrays are navigational beacons, constructed under Navigation Mandate 9, which authorizes any member state to deploy navigational aids in recognized shipping corridors. The Terran Confederation filed deployment notices for each array. All filings were acknowledged and approved. She advanced to a side-by-side comparison. The arrays contain standard navigational transponders and emergency distress relays. No surveillance equipment. The Concord's own technical inspection service surveyed them 8 months ago and certified them as navigational infrastructure. She advanced once more. The tribunal reclassified the arrays based on an unattributed intelligence assessment that was never subjected to technical review, never signed by a named analyst, and never submitted to the adjudicators for independent verification. She placed the assessment in the display. No author, no department seal, no methodology, no supporting data, no chain of custody, a single page of conclusions floating in an evidentiary vacuum. The gallery stared at it the way one stares at something that should not exist in a system that calls itself lawful. 11-1, Verdict 11 vacated. One verdict remained. The capstone. The charge that would, if sustained, erase the Terran Confederation from the Concord's membership rolls with the permanence of a species declared extinct. Valeth felt the weight of it before the clerk spoke. The chamber felt it too. For 11 verdicts, the proceedings had carried the rhythm of demolition. But verdict 12 was not another brick. It was the keystone, and the keystone's removal would bring down the entire arch. The dawn bell was 40 minutes away. The light through the dome had shifted from cerulean to pale gold, and the 3 Terran frigates caught the sunrise on their hulls, gleaming like coins turned in a hand. Doranth Vale had not spoken in over an hour. He sat behind the obsidian bench with the stillness of a being who understood that the structure he had built was collapsing around him, stone by stone, and that the being dismantling it was someone he had personally destroyed 11 years ago. Verdict 12, the clerk read. His voice shook. Issued 8 months prior. The Terran Confederation is found guilty under Article 14 of the Concord Charter, specifically the systematic undermining of Concord institutional authority through coordinated diplomatic subversion. The gallery went still. Article 14 was the exile clause, the same article that had been used against Valeth. Applied to an entire confederation, it meant total expulsion. Permanent. Irrevocable. Valeth looked at the data chip in her hand. She did not place it on the scanner. Not yet. Presiding arbiter, she said, before I present evidence on verdict 12, I wish to enter a procedural observation into the record. Doranth's eyelids flickered. He could not refuse. Proceed. 11 verdicts have been vacated tonight. In each case, the evidence was incomplete, redacted, or fabricated. In 7 cases, the redaction or fabrication was traceable to the same office. In 4 cases, the tribunal's own governing standards were not consulted. In 2 cases, existing Concord reports clearing the Terran Confederation were withheld. In 1 case, the presiding arbiter attempted to call an unauthorized recess. She paused. The chamber was so quiet she could hear the hum of the holographic projectors. This is not a pattern of error. Errors are random. This is a pattern of construction. Someone built these verdicts. Someone selected the evidence, shaped the record, steered the outcomes, and pointed them all toward a single result: the progressive isolation and eventual expulsion of the Terran Confederation from the Concord. Absolute silence. 1,100 beings and not one breathed audibly. Verdict 12 charges the Terran Confederation with systematic undermining of Concord institutional authority, Valeth said. The evidence I have presented tonight demonstrates that the systematic undermining was not conducted by the Terran Confederation. It was conducted against them, by this body, through this process, using these instruments. She placed the final chip on the scanner. The display showed a financial ledger, transfers of funds from the Kalori Foreign Ministry to the Presidium's intelligence liaison over an 11-year period. Amounts, dates, account routing codes, authorization signatures. Beside it, a parallel timeline of the 12 verdicts, each correlated to a transfer that preceded it by 40 to 60 days. 12 payments, 12 verdicts, 11 years of purchased justice. The Kalori Foreign Ministry funded the fabrication of evidence against the Terran Confederation, Valeth said. It did so because Terran humanitarian programs in the outer worlds were reducing Kalori economic influence in regions the Kalori had treated as their exclusive trade monopoly for 4 centuries. Crop rotation schedules and seed banks were a greater threat to Kalori revenue than warships. The Kalori chose to eliminate the competition through institutional capture rather than direct conflict, because direct conflict with the Terran Confederation would have been suicidal, and the Kalori knew it. She looked at Doranth. The presiding arbiter is Kalori. The intelligence liaison who fabricated evidence in 7 verdicts reports to the Kalori Foreign Ministry. The lone dissent on 6 of tonight's rulings came from the Kalori adjudicator. The financial transfers bear the authorization signature of the Kalori Foreign Minister's Chief of Staff. Doranth did not move. He sat behind the obsidian bench, hands flat, rigid as stone, and said nothing. Zenith Rahl stood. These documents are unverified. The advocate has produced financial records without chain of custody certification. I move to exclude them. Valith did not flinch. The documents were obtained from the Concord's own central banking archive, which stores all intergovernmental transfers as a matter of standard protocol. The chain of custody runs from the archive to this chamber. The archive's authentication seal is on each document. The adjudicator is welcome to verify it through the archive's public query system, accessible from any terminal in this building. She turned to the bench. Shall I wait while the adjudicator verifies? Rahl sat down. She did not verify. The offer to do so publicly had been more damaging than any verification could have been. By declining, she had communicated that she already knew the documents were authentic. 1,000 small calculations happened simultaneously in 1,000 diplomatic minds, alliances being recalibrated, risks reassessed, diplomatic cover quietly withdrawn. Marinith Saloon, the Sethrani adjudicator, stood. I move for an immediate vote on Verdict 12, and I move for a concurrent vote of no confidence in the presiding arbiter. The chamber erupted. Not with violence, with procedure. Motions seconded, counter-motions raised. The clerk's carapace clicked like rain on metal. The Peloran demanded a point of order. The Tessarine cited precedent. 3 delegates in the upper gallery began filing formal diplomatic protests. Through it all, Valith stood at the podium and waited. She had learned that the machinery, for all its slowness, eventually arrived at the destination the evidence demanded. Verdict 12. Vacated, 10-2. Vote of no confidence in presiding arbiter Doranth Vale, carried, 9-3. The 3 dissenting votes included both Kalori seats and the Peloran, whose government would face its own uncomfortable questions in the days ahead. Doranth stood from the bench. He moved slowly as though his joints had stiffened. His face was a mask so rigid it looked like it might shatter. He did not speak. He did not look at Valith. He walked down from the bench, through the center aisle, past the podium and out of the chamber. The doors closed behind him with a resonance like a held breath released. The dawn bell rang. Its tone filled the dome, a deep harmonic that Valith felt in her sternum. Through the glass above, the sunrise had turned the sky to gold, and the 3 Terran frigates hung in that gold like dark promises kept. They had not moved. They had not needed to. Their presence had been a statement in the language Valith had learned from the humans. We are here, we have been here, and we are not going anywhere. Marinith Saloon, acting as interim arbiter, addressed the chamber. The tribunal's record will reflect that all 12 standing verdicts against the Terran Confederation have been vacated. Trade embargoes, territorial forfeitures, mining sanctions, and diplomatic restrictions are dissolved, effective immediately. The tribunal recommends a full investigation into the intelligence liaison and the Kalori Foreign Ministry's involvement in evidence fabrication across 11 years of proceedings. She looked at Valith. The tribunal notes that the exile of Valith Kas was imposed under Article 14 on the basis of her statement that the Presidium's evidence was fabricated. Tonight's proceedings have demonstrated that her statement was accurate. The tribunal recommends the immediate restoration of her diplomatic credentials and the formal recognition of her service to the integrity of this institution. Valith inclined her head. She did not speak. There was nothing to add. The record had spoken for itself, chip by chip, verdict by verdict, through a long night in which the only weapons were patience, preparation, and the refusal to be silenced. The gallery began to stand. Not in applause. The Concord did not applaud. They stood in the way that large bodies stand when they understand they have witnessed something that will reshape the institution they serve. It was not celebration. It was acknowledgement, weighted and solemn and irreversible. Valith gathered her satchel. The data chips were spent, each one a year of exile converted into a minute of evidence. each one a piece of truth that had been waiting in archives and filing systems and banking records for someone with the patience to find it and the standing to present it. She walked up the center aisle. Delegates parted to let her pass. Some met her eyes. The Vashini adjudicator dipped her crest, the iridescent scales catching the dawn light. Soren Thai, the Dren, pressed a closed fist to his chest. The Dren I salute for a debt recognized. A Tessarine scribe in the lower gallery inclined her head with a formality that suggested she had already begun drafting the historical account. At the doors a figure waited, human male. Late 50s, gray at the temples, wearing a dark suit with no insignia and no rank markings. Commander Alistair Kell, Terran Confederation Naval Intelligence. He had not entered the chamber. He had waited in the corridor for the entire session, standing against the far wall with his arms at his sides and a communication earpiece in his left ear, the kind that received but did not transmit. He had heard every verdict, every vote, every crack in Dorrant's composure. He had heard it all, and he had not intervened, had not sent a message or filed a protest or leveraged the frigates in orbit. He had stood and listened. 12 for 12, he said, quiet, flat, the way humans spoke when the weight of the words carried itself and any embellishment would only weaken them. Valith studied him. His suit was creased from hours of standing. You could have sent your own advocate, a human, someone with current credentials and institutional standing. We could have, Kell said. We sent the one who was right 11 years ago. The simplicity of it struck her with a force she had not expected. Not the logic, she understood the logic, but the weight of the decision it represented. The Terran Confederation had staked the outcome of 12 verdicts, the entirety of their standing in the Concord, on a Rithani exile who had been stripped of her credentials, barred from 6 sovereign corridors, and left to rot on a way station for over a decade. They had done so because she had spoken a single sentence of truth in a chamber that punished truth, and they had decided that the sentence, and the person who spoke it, were worth more than any institutional credential the Concord could confer. That was either extraordinary faith or extraordinary calculation. With humans, Valith had learned, it was usually both. The frigates in orbit, she said. How long have they been there? 6 days. And before that? Monitoring station at the edge of the Tessarine corridor, quiet, watching. How long? Kell's expression did not change. 11 years. Valith's secondary membranes closed and opened. 11 years. The frigates had been there, or their predecessors had been there since the day she was exiled. Not a threat, a vigil. She had thought during the long years on Tessara Station that she had been forgotten, that the humans had moved on, built their quiet alliances in the outer worlds, and let the Concord's verdicts accumulate without concern. She had been wrong. They had not forgotten. They had been preparing. The data chips in her satchel, the ones that arrived 6 weeks ago in unmarked cargo packing, had not materialized from nothing. Someone had gathered them. Someone had spent years pulling documents from archives, cross-referencing financial records, and building the evidentiary chain that Valith had presented tonight. The data chips, she said. The financial ledger, the redacted footnotes, the withheld reports. You gathered all of it. Some of it, Kell said. Your former staff gathered the rest. 17 people, across 4 species and 9 Concord jurisdictions. Some risked prosecution under the Concord's information security statutes to pull those files. The banking records came from an archivist on Kalar itself, a Kalori national who understood what the transfers meant and chose to copy them rather than let them age into deletion. She lost her position 3 months ago. The Foreign Ministry cited a routine restructuring. She is on Tessara Station now, 2 corridors from your old quarters. You were not certain this would work, Valith said. It was not a question. We were certain the evidence was solid. Whether the tribunal would follow the evidence was a different question. Institutions under pressure do not always choose integrity. But you sent me anyway. We sent you because you chose integrity the first time. when it cost you everything. The frigates were not a contingency plan. They were a statement of commitment. If the tribunal had ruled against the evidence, we would have withdrawn from the Concord entirely and formalized the alternative structures we have been building in the outer worlds for the past decade. Valith looked at him sharply. You have been building alternative structures. Since year 3 of the verdicts, trade networks, mutual defense arrangements, agricultural support programs, the same programs the Concord tried to criminalize through Verdict 6. The Terran Confederation did not spend 11 years passively absorbing punishment, Ambassador. We spent 11 years building a position from which we could survive without the Concord, so that when the moment came to challenge it, we could do so without desperation. Desperation makes poor advocacy. The word ambassador landed in the space between them. Kel had used it before she had accepted the appointment. He was already thinking in the tense of what came next. Valith stood in the corridor of the Tessarene Grand Spire, dawn light falling through the high windows in long amber shafts, and felt the weight of 11 years shift on her shoulders. It did not disappear. It rearranged itself into something she could carry differently, not the weight of exile. The weight of vindication, which was heavier in its own way, because it carried with it the obligation to do something with what had been won. What happens now? She asked. Kel reached into his jacket and produced a single folded document. Terran diplomatic paper, cream-colored, heavy, embossed with the Confederation seal in silver. He held it out. Your appointment, he said. Ambassador Plenipotentiary, Terran Confederation to the Interstellar Concord, full authority, effective immediately. Valith took the document. She did not open it. She held it in her hands, feeling the weight, the texture, the reality of what it represented. 11 years ago she had walked out of this building with nothing. Now she held the authority to walk back in and reshape the relationship between humanity and the Concord from the ground up. The Concord will resist, she said. The Kelori control 23% of the Concord's trade infrastructure. Their diplomatic corps is embedded in every major committee. Doranth's removal is a blow, but the apparatus he served is still intact. Kel looked at her with the expression she had come to recognize over 9 years of service, the expression that said nothing and meant everything. They'll resist, he agreed, but they'll resist in a chamber where 12 verdicts just fell, in front of a record that shows 11 years of fabricated evidence. With an intelligence liaison facing criminal investigation and a presiding arbiter removed by his own tribunal, they can resist, but the ground they were standing on is gone. She folded the document and placed it in the pocket of her charcoal coat. I will need an office, she said. Kel almost smiled. The expression crossed his face and vanished, replaced by composed neutrality, the face that had already won and saw no need to announce it. Your old one is still there, he said. We never cleared it out. 11 years. They had maintained her office for 11 years, had kept it furnished, kept her nameplate on the door, not because they expected her to return. Because the office, like the frigates, like the monitoring station, like the 17 people gathering evidence across 9 jurisdictions, was part of the architecture of a future they intended to build regardless of how long it took. She had a sudden, vivid memory of the day she was exiled. Walking this same corridor, her credentials confiscated, the doors closing behind her, the silence of the chamber like a verdict in itself. She had been 34, young for a Rithani diplomat, and she had believed in the way that the young believe things that the truth would protect her. It had not. The truth had cost her 11 years, her career, her standing, and most of the relationships she had built in a lifetime of service. But the truth had also created an anchor, a fixed point around which 17 people and a Terran intelligence officer had organized their efforts for over a decade. The sentence she had spoken, the sentence that had ended her career, had become the foundation of the case she had just argued. There was a particular kind of justice in that. Not the clean, immediate justice of a wrong righted in the moment. The slower, heavier justice that arrived years later, carried on the backs of people who had chosen to remember. Valeth walked back toward the chamber. The delegates watched her pass. She did not hurry. She did not slow. She walked at the pace of someone who had waited 11 years and had no intention of wasting the time she had earned, nor rushing through what remained to be done. At the chamber doors, she paused and looked back at Kel. He stood where she had left him, hands at his sides, watching her with the quiet attention of a man who had completed his mission and understood that the next phase belonged to someone else. "Commander," she said, "tell your frigates they can come down to the port. They have been up there long enough." Kel's hand moved to his collar communicator. A single tap, no words. Valeth turned and entered the chamber. Behind her, through the glass dome, the 3 Terran frigates began their descent. Slowly, unhurried, breaking through the upper atmosphere in columns of white vapor that caught the dawn light and scattered it across the sky like something being returned to the world after a long absence. The chamber watched them come down. 1,100 delegates, the remaining adjudicators, the clerk of record, the scribes, the translators, the intelligence officers who had built the lies and the ones who had not. They all watched the frigates descend through the golden morning sky, and they understood in the silence that filled the dome that this was not a threat. It never had been. It was a homecoming. Valeth took her place at the podium one final time. The interim arbiter looked at her. The chamber looked at her. She placed her hands flat on the brushed steel surface and felt the cold metal steady her, the way it had steadied her through 12 verdicts and a long night, and the patient dismantling of a lie that had been 11 years in the building. "The Terran Confederation requests that its delegation be seated at the next general session of the Concord Assembly," she said. "We have 11 years of work to do." She said nothing more. The chamber did not need her to. The record was in the display. The frigates were on the ground. The dawn had come. The interim arbiter inclined her head. "The request is noted and will be placed on the assembly agenda." Valeth stepped back from the podium. She gathered her satchel, empty now save for one data chip she had not used, a chip containing nothing but a single line of text. The sentence she had spoken 11 years ago, the sentence that had cost her everything, the sentence that tonight's proceedings had proven true. She left it in the satchel. Some evidence did not need to be presented. Some evidence carried itself. She walked up the aisle one final time. The gallery stood as she passed, not in applause but in the heavy silence of recognition, the silence that falls when a large body of people understands that it has witnessed the turning of something that will not turn back. On Tessara Station, the Kilori archivist who had sacrificed her career for banking records was probably watching the broadcast. In 9 jurisdictions, 16 other people who had gathered evidence were learning that their work had mattered. Valeth did not know all their names. She would learn them. She owed them that. 11 years of exile, 12 verdicts, one night. And the dawn bell still ringing in the dome above, fading now, its last harmonics settling into the stone and the steel and the glass, marking the end of something old and the beginning of whatever came next. Valeth Kas walked through the doors and did not look back.